She knew they were laughing before she ever heard the sound. It was not loud. It was not open. It was the kind of laughter people use when they believe they are being polite, when they believe their judgment is justified, when they believe no one important will challenge them. She felt it in the way their eyes moved over her, slowly and without interest, pausing just long enough on her coat to register its age, just long enough on her shoes to form a conclusion. The interview room was clean, modern, carefully designed to feel neutral. White walls, a long glass table, 3 chairs on one side, 1 chair on the other. Everything about the room suggested fairness, structure, professionalism. Everything except the air. The woman sat alone, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had chosen this position carefully, not because she wanted to appear small, but because she wanted to appear calm. Her coat was old but clean. Her hair was pulled into a low bun, not styled, not careless, simply practical. She did not fidget. She did not smile too much. She did not try to earn approval before it was offered. Still, she could feel it. This interview was already over. One of the interviewers glanced at her resume again, though he had clearly already read it. Another leaned back slightly in his chair, crossing his arms in a way that suggested distance rather than comfort. The third cleared his throat, preparing to speak, already certain of the direction this conversation would take. "So," he said, tapping the paper lightly with his finger, "can you explain the gap in your employment history?" The question was delivered calmly, professionally. It was the kind of question that appeared neutral on the surface, but carried weight beneath it. The kind of question that assumed weakness, instability, or failure. She nodded slowly, as if she had expected it, because she had. "I took time away to care for my mother," she said. Her voice was steady, not defensive, not apologetic. "She was sick." There was a pause, then a sound, a soft chuckle, not loud enough to call out, not cruel enough to be obvious, just enough to be heard. Another interviewer glanced sideways at his colleague and then back at her resume. "This position can be demanding," he said. "We usually look for candidates with more recent experience." The word recent landed heavily in the room. She nodded again. She did not explain how many nights she had spent awake in hospital chairs. She did not describe the medications, the appointments, the quiet fear that settles into a person when they realize responsibility has replaced choice. She did not talk about what she had given up or what it had cost her. She had learned something long ago. When people have already decided who you are, explanations feel like begging. Her name was Marianne, and she had not come to this interview hoping to be hired. She had come to see something. Years earlier, Marianne had worked for this very company, back when it was smaller, quieter, and far closer to collapse than anyone now sitting at this table wanted to remember. Back then, the office had not felt polished. The hallways had not been silent with confidence. There had been tension, late nights, emergency meetings that ended without solutions. Marianne had not held a senior title. She had not been invited to strategy lunches or leadership retreats. She had been brought in on a temporary contract, a supporting role, easily overlooked and easily dismissed. But during one critical year, when losses began to outpace explanations, it was Marianne who stayed. She stayed late when others left early. She stayed quiet when others argued. She stayed focused when panic crept into every conversation. She reworked projections no one else wanted to touch. She found inefficiencies buried so deep they had been accepted as unavoidable. She saw patterns others missed, not because she was smarter, but because she was patient. Her report had moved up the chain quickly, without her name. By the time the company stabilized, the crisis quietly reframed as a success story, her contract ended without ceremony. No farewell, in no acknowledgement, just a polite email and a reminder to return her badge. Life did not pause to reflect on fairness. Her mother got sick not long after. Bills followed, time passed, and the company grew. Now, years later, Marianne sat in a different room, in the same building, watching a new generation measure her worth in minutes. One of the interviewers leaned forward slightly. "Why do you want to work here?" he asked. It was a standard question. Safe. Predictable. Marianne lifted her eyes and met his gaze. "I helped build something here once," she said. "I wanted to see what it became." The silence that followed was not respectful. It was confused. One of them smiled thinly. Another made a note on his pad that felt more like a conclusion than an observation. She felt it then. The familiar pull. The instinct to stand up. To thank them for their time and walk out before dignity could be stripped away piece by piece. She could already hear the unspoken verdict forming. Not a fit. Outdated. Overqualified once, underqualified now. But she stayed. Because there was one thing she needed to know. She needed to see whether this place remembered what it owed, even if it did not remember her. The door behind them opened. At first, no one reacted. Then chairs shifted, spines straightened, hands moved away from relaxed positions and back into practiced professionalism. The CEO had entered the room. He did not speak immediately. His eyes moved across the table, then stopped. They landed on Marianne. For a moment, the room felt suspended, as if time itself had paused to witness something unfinished. Then he said her name. "Marianne?" It was not loud. It was not dramatic. But it was unmistakable. The interviewers froze. She stood slowly, her movements calm, deliberate. "Yes." The CEO's expression changed in stages. Surprise, recognition, and then something far heavier than either. Respect. "I've been looking for you for years," he said. No one spoke. The room that had felt neutral moments ago now felt exposed, as if every assumption made within it had been placed under a harsh light. The CEO turned to the interview panel. "Do you know who this woman is?" No one answered. "She's the reason this company survived its worst financial year," he continued. "Her analysis changed everything, and she never took credit for it." The weight of the room shifted. Marianne remained still. She did not smile. She did not nod. She simply listened, because this moment was not about recognition. It was about truth. The room stayed silent longer than anyone expected. Not the awkward kind of silence that begs to be filled, but the heavy kind that presses down on people, forcing them to confront what they would rather avoid. Marianne could feel it settling into the space between the glass table and the white walls, sinking into the chairs, clinging to every unspoken thought. The interviewers did not look at her now. They looked at the CEO. And for the first time since she had entered the room, Marianne understood something clearly. This was not an interruption. This was a reckoning. The CEO did not raise his voice. He did not accuse anyone. He simply remained standing, his hands resting lightly on the back of an empty chair, his gaze steady. "Before any decisions are made," he said, "I think we should talk about how we got here." No one objected. No one moved. Years earlier, long before this room had been renovated and polished into neutrality, the company had been on the edge of collapse. Revenue projections looked optimistic on the surface, but underneath them were cracks that widened with every quarter. Teams blamed the market. Leaders blamed timing. Everyone blamed something external. Marianne had seen the problem differently. She had noticed patterns others dismissed as noise, costs that repeated themselves quietly across departments, assumptions that had never been questioned because questioning them would have required uncomfortable answers. She had spent nights cross-checking data sets, not because she had been asked to, but because something felt wrong. When she finally presented her findings to her immediate supervisor, the response had been cautious, almost dismissive. "This is interesting," he had said, "but it's not our priority right now." So she refined it. She clarified it. She removed anything that could be misinterpreted as criticism and focused only on solutions. When the report finally reached higher leadership, it did so stripped of context, stripped of authorship, and stripped of the quiet persistence that had created it. The company survived. Bonuses were paid, promotions were announced, Marianne's contract expired. The CEO paused, letting the memories settle. At the time, he continued, I was not here yet. I was brought in after the crisis when stability had already returned. I inherited a success story. He looked directly at Marianne, and for years, I wondered why that success felt incomplete. The interviewers shifted in their seats. One of them cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. With respect, he said, we weren't aware of this history. The CEO nodded. That's exactly the problem. He turned back to Marianne. When I found the original documents, your name appeared only once, buried, almost erased. Marianne felt a familiar tightening in her chest, not from anger, but from recognition, the quiet truth of being useful without being visible. She spoke then, her voice calm, measured. I didn't come back because I wanted credit, she said. I came back because I wanted to understand something. Everyone looked at her. I wanted to see whether this company had learned how to recognize value, she continued, or whether it still only saw what looked impressive on paper. No one interrupted her. For years, she said, I watched from a distance as this place grew. I watched how success was described, how stories were told, and whose voices were amplified. I wondered whether the systems that failed quietly had ever been examined. She paused, allowing the words to land. The interview, she added softly, answered my question. The air shifted again. One of the interviewers straightened defensively. We were just following standard procedure, he said. We assess based on qualifications, timelines, and impressions, Marianne said gently. The CEO raised a hand, not to silence, but to slow the conversation. This is not about blame, he said. It's about awareness. He turned back to the panel. How many people have we passed over because they did not look like success? No one answered. How many times have we mistaken confidence for competence? He continued. How often have we rewarded visibility while overlooking contribution? Marianne watched them carefully. She did not feel vindicated. She felt tired, not physically, but emotionally. Tired of carrying truths that were only acknowledged when someone powerful chose to notice them. Tired of systems that congratulated themselves for outcomes while forgetting the people who made those outcomes possible. One of the interviewers finally spoke again, quieter now. Why didn't you ever say anything? He asked her. Marianne considered the question. Because saying something requires someone to listen, she replied, and listening requires humility. She remembered the early days clearly, the small desk, the temporary badge, the subtle way conversations paused when she approached. She remembered choosing her words carefully, deciding which battles were worth fighting and which ones would cost her more than they were worth. She remembered the email that ended her contract. Short, polite, final. Life after that had not been kind, but it had been honest. There were no illusions, no false promises, just responsibility, repetition, and resilience. Caring for her mother had taught her patience in ways no corporate environment ever could. It had taught her to show up even when recognition was absent. I learned something important during those years, Marianne said. Work reveals character. So does pressure. But invisibility reveals systems. The CEO nodded slowly. That's why I asked you to stay, he said. Not for the role, for the conversation. He turned to the panel. We can teach skills, we can update resumes, but we cannot teach integrity if we don't value it. The room no longer felt like an interview room. It felt like a mirror. One of the interviewers looked down at the resume again, as if seeing it for the first time. Another closed his notebook without a word. The third stared at the table, his reflection distorted in the glass. Marianne stood quietly, observing. She thought about the younger version of herself, the one who believed that good work would always be enough. She thought about how long it had taken to understand that systems do not change unless someone forces them to look at themselves. The CEO broke the silence again. "Marianne," he said, "I want to ask you something." She met his gaze. "If you had known how this interview would unfold," he asked, "would you still have come?" She did not answer immediately, and she thought about the discomfort, the judgment, the familiar sting of being underestimated. "Yes," she said finally, "because discomfort reveals truth faster than comfort ever does." The CEO nodded. He turned to the panel one last time. "We will continue this discussion," he said, "but not today." They stood. As the interviewers gathered their papers, none of them met Marianne's eyes. Not out of arrogance now, but uncertainty, the kind that lingers after assumptions collapse. Marianne collected her coat. As she walked toward the door, the CEO spoke again, quieter this time. "You were right to test us," he said, "and we failed." She paused, her hand on the door. "Failure isn't the end," she replied. "Avoiding it is." She left the room without another word. The hallway outside felt different, not triumphant, not light, but clear. Marianne did not leave the building immediately. She walked slowly down the hallway, past glass offices and muted conversations, past walls lined with framed awards and photographs that celebrated growth, innovation, and leadership. She had seen these images before, years ago, when they were fewer and less polished. Back then, the faces had looked hopeful. Now, they looked certain. Certainty, she had learned, was not always earned. She paused near the elevator, pressing the button once and waiting as the soft hum of the building filled the silence. Her reflection stared back at her from the mirrored doors, unchanged by what had just happened. The same coat, the same tired eyes, the same posture shaped by years of responsibility rather than recognition. The doors opened. She stepped inside alone. As the elevator descended, Marianne thought about the question the CEO had asked her. If she had known how the interview would unfold, would she still have come? The answer remained yes, because some truths only reveal themselves when you are willing to sit in discomfort long enough to see what emerges. Outside, the air felt cooler. The city moved the way it always did, indifferent to quiet reckonings happening behind glass walls. People hurried past, phones in hand, eyes fixed on destinations that felt urgent in the moment. Marianne stood still for a few seconds, grounding herself in the present, then began walking. She did not know what would happen next, and for the first time in a long while, she was at peace with that. Over the following weeks, changes began to ripple through the company. They did not arrive with announcements or public statements. They arrived quietly, the way meaningful shifts often do. Hiring processes were reviewed, interview panels were restructured, evaluation criteria were rewritten, not to sound more inclusive, but to become more honest. The CEO did not reach out immediately. He waited. He waited because he understood something most leaders learn too late. Trust, once broken, is not rebuilt through urgency. It is rebuilt through consistency. When he finally contacted Marianne, it was not with an offer, it was with a question. "What would accountability look like to you?" he asked. Marianne considered the message carefully before responding. "Accountability," she wrote back, "looks like remembering who did the work when the work was invisible." They met days later, not in a conference room, but in a quiet office away from the center of the building. There were no panels, no resumes, no formalities, just two people having an honest conversation. The CEO did not promise her a position. He did not apologize again. He listened, He listened as Marianne spoke about systems that reward presentation over substance, about how often care work, emotional labor, and quiet persistence go unnoticed because they do not announce themselves, about how easily organizations confuse confidence with competence and urgency with importance. "You can't fix what you refuse to see," she told him. He nodded. "I don't want you to come back for us," he said. "I want you to come back for what this place could become." Marianne did not answer right away. She thought about her mother, whose health had stabilized but whose needs remained constant. She thought about the years she had spent rebuilding a sense of self outside of titles and recognition. She thought about how much energy it takes to return to a place that once discarded you quietly. "I'm not interested in proving myself again," she said finally. "I wouldn't ask you to," he replied. That was when she knew the conversation was different. Marianne did not return as an employee. She returned as a consultant, not to solve problems quietly, but to make them visible. Her role was clear. She would not be responsible for outcomes. She would be responsible for questions, for pointing out patterns others avoided, for naming uncomfortable truths before they became crises. Some people welcomed her presence, others resisted it. Change rarely arrives without friction, but over time, something shifted. Some people began to ask better questions in meetings. Credit moved more carefully. Decisions slowed just enough to allow thought instead of reflex. The culture did not transform overnight, but it began to bend. And Marianne did not stay forever. She never intended to. When her work was finished, she stepped away without ceremony, the same way she had entered, quietly. On her last day, the CEO walked her to the elevator. "We should have seen you sooner," he said. She smiled gently. "Seeing sooner isn't the hard part," she replied. "Seeing clearly is." The doors closed. Marianne returned to a life that felt balanced in ways she once believed impossible. She took fewer obligations and more walks. She spent time with her mother without rushing. She pursued work that aligned with her values rather than her résumé. Sometimes, she passed that building on her way through the city. Sometimes she did not. It no longer defined her. The interviewers who once sat across from her remembered the day clearly, not because they were humiliated, but because they were changed. They learned that judgment formed too quickly often says more about the observer than the observed. They learned that professionalism without humility is simply performance. And Marianne? She learned something too, that dignity does not demand recognition. It survives without it. Some people are underestimated because they are weak. Others are underestimated because they are quiet. And sometimes, the greatest mistake you can make is assuming someone's value based on the moment you meet them, rather than the history they carry. Because not everyone who sits across from you is asking for opportunity. Some are simply holding up a mirror,